Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is John Lazarou. I am the Media Relations Manager here at GBMC. Before I introduce the members of our panel, I'd like to offer just a quick background on why we are here today. Does anybody here know what Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is? For the exception of those in philanthropy or in the marketing office, is anybody else? No? Okay, so Ehlers-Danlos is a syndrome that affects 1 in approximately 5,000 people in the United States. It is an uncommon inherited condition that negatively affects the connective tissues that bind together our skin, ligaments, and bones, and cause significant pain. Sufferers often possess symptoms such as double jointness, joint pain, easy bruising, and abnormal scarring, to more serious symptoms such as weak blood vessels, organ rupture, and spinal scoliosis. More severe types, such as vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, can be life-threatening, as fragile blood vessels and internal organs can spontaneously rupture. So you can imagine the constant pain, both physical and psychological, that those who live with EDS face on a daily basis. We're going to have more on this from a member of our panel later on. Speaking of who's a member of the Ehlers-Danlos Society, and more on this society as well. The society is important to point out that back in May of last year, they hosted an international symposium that featured over 80 scientists and physicians from all over the world. They participated in presenting 18 different papers about various aspects regarding Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Now, the majority of those papers are featured in this month's special issue of the American Journal of Medical Genetics. The research has been dubbed by some as a game changer for the Ehlers-Danlos community and for those with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which has been summarized as the most neglected disorder in modern medicine. This long-awaited review updates for the first time in over 2 decades diagnostic criteria, management and care guidelines for this debilitating disorder. Lastly, why GBMC? Why were we selected to be here today? We were picked to host today's event because we are, here at GBMC, the home of Society Center for Clinical Care and Research for the Ehlers-Danlos Society. We provide comprehensive clinical care for patients, professional education for physicians, and cutting-edge research for this unbearable ailment. The center and its staff has helped expand treatment options for patients, raise awareness among physicians, and have continued research into the causes of and possible cures for EDS. In closing, we hope that today's event can help educate the healthcare community and promote greater awareness and understanding of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome to the public. At this point, I would like to introduce the members of our panel. First, Ms. Lara Bloom, Co-Executive Director of the Ehlers-Danlos Society, who will highlight the phases of Ehlers-Danlos syndromes and potential benefits of the new guidelines. Next to her, Dr. John Chisar, President and CEO of the GBMC healthcare system, who will discuss the relationship between the Society and GBMC. And Dr. Clair Francomano, Geneticist, Director of the EDS Center and of Adult Genetics at the Harvey Institute of Human Genetics here at GBMC. Please note that we will hold a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentations by the members of our panel. Without further ado, Ms. Lara Bloom.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John, and thank you to everyone for joining us here today to celebrate this monumental time in the history of Ehlers-Danlos syndromes. I'm going to start by sharing this video with you that I hope will bring in context the importance of the work that was done.
You Why don't you ever believe me? When will you ever just see? Why don't you ever believe me? Why won't you ever just see?
34 years,
26 years,
6 years, 21 years,
69 years,
22 years,
14 years and 7 months,
5 years,
41 years,
25 years, 7 years.
1 year and 8 months, 23 years and 4 months,
Mama is English.
51 years, 2 months,
13 years.
30 years.
Take away my pain, heal all my wounds, run with me through the pouring rain, be my stepping stones. Someday you're gonna believe me. Someday now you're gonna see. Someday you're gonna believe me. Someday now you're gonna see.
20 years and
20 years.
10 years,
18 years. Oh, it's 50 Jahre. 7 years.
40 years.
23 years.
24 years,
4 years.
25
25 years.
17 years.
28 years.
7.5 years.
13 years.
16 years.
20 years.
42 years. 17 years.
27 years.
22 years.
14 and a half years.
2 years. 5 years.
30 years. 16 years. 35 years. 33 years. 16 years. 8 years and 3 months.
4 years. 29 years.
57 years,
32 years.
26 years.
44 years. 21 years. 6 months.
27 years.
53 años.
30 years. 8 years. 38 years.
30 years.
49 years. 57 years.
28 years.
12 years. 24 years.
2 years.
26 years. 40 years. 52 years. 34 years and 2 months.
4 years, 10 months.
This I promise you.
The last time that the diagnostic criteria were published for EDS was in 1997. That was 20 years ago. We began by showing you this video because it highlights just how long it usually takes someone suffering to get their diagnosis. An international consortium on the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes and related disorders was established to work on the new nosology and for the first time published management and care guidelines. I work for the Ehlers-Danlos Society, which was launched last May to focus on assisting the consortium with their work, to help facilitate global collaborative research and to bring together the patient community so that geography no longer determines your quality of life when living with one of the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes or the newly described hypermobility spectrum disorders. Other than the incredible individuals like Dr. Clair Francomano and hubs of expertise dotted around the world, such as here at GBMC, EDS has been one of the most neglected disorders in modern medicine. As patients, we are not listened to, respected, validated, managed, diagnosed effectively, or even given a good chance to live an improved quality of life. We were trying to fix something that was broken. There is a common journey that most people suffering with one of the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes or hypermobility spectrum disorders go through. It often takes years to find a doctor to diagnose the condition. And once you are sent back to rely on your local services, there is nobody there to ensure you have the right management or treatment. And this issue is echoed across the world. Movement is everything with these disorders, but it is what is taken away for so many. Smothered by pain and a body that can give up on you at every turn, and no specialist who knows how to diagnose it, let alone manage what you have. This condition is invisible, so even though we appear to be living actively and normally, it can mean there are days when it's too hard to even get out of bed. It can mean you can get ill more easily and it takes longer to recover. It can mean that you do not know what a day without pain and exhaustion is like. It can mean periods of times in wheelchairs, on walking sticks, and using braces. EDS and HSDs can be multi-systemic and could affect your GI system, your autonomic system, and more. One of the things we're hoping to change with this new criteria is the cycle of deconditioning that is happening. Because of the lack of education and treatment out there, patients can become much sicker than they could have done with better management. There are some who would live on the more severe end of the spectrum regardless, but there are many who are there because they are not being given access to the correct care and treatment. It is a domino effect that can then involve psychological issues, depression, anxiety, inability to work, or being able to have that quality of life everyone deserves. The other result of this is the cost to healthcare services. Patients are being bounced around between specialists and costing the healthcare industry money that doesn't need to be spent. If medical professionals educate themselves with this new criteria, learn about the new hypermobility spectrum disorders, and discover the management and care guidelines that the consortium recommended, then patients will end up being accurately diagnosed and given the chance that they deserve. I am so grateful to this international collaborative effort of dedicated clinicians and researchers who work tirelessly to crystallise our current understanding of the syndromes and hypermobility spectrum disorders in ways that are immediately applicable to care and will provide the medical community with tools that they have long awaited for. And the Ehlers-Danlos Society looks forward to working closely with them all to ensure that we are able to do the research that is so critically needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Up next is Dr. John Chisar, President and CEO of the GBMC Healthcare System, who will discuss the relationship between us and the Ehlers-Danlos Society. Dr. Chisar.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. The GBMC Healthcare System is honored to be the site of the Ehlers-Danlos Society Center for Research and Clinical Care. And we are very, very proud of Dr. Clair Francomano and her team. Today we are excited that the publication of these updated guidelines for the first time in 20 years will make it easier for clinicians everywhere to give people with the syndrome the evidence-based care that they deserve. People know me as an administrator. Few people know that actually I practiced as a developmental pediatrician for about 11 years earlier in my career. And I know the value of expertise. I know the value of having somebody like Dr. Francomano who understands the spectrum of disorders and is actually an expert, and the value of that to patients. No physician, nurse, or clinician can know everything, and it takes people specialized in rare or less common diseases to really be able to deliver the kind of care to every patient every time that we would want if it was our own loved one who had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or the spectrum of hypermobility. So today, we at GBMC are absolutely delighted that this tool is being published to bring improvements in care to people who really need it. So I want to thank all of you for attending today. I particularly want to thank the members of the press that are here today, because without your help, we can't get the word out, and we therefore, the tool will not be as valuable. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Dr. Chisar. Up next is Dr. Clair Francomano, geneticist, director of the EDS Center and of Adult Genetics here at the Harvey Institute of Human Genetics at GBMC. Dr. Francomano.
Thank you so much, John, and I'd like to add my thanks to the members of the press and to all of those of you who took the time to be here today, and to Dr. Chisar and to Lara for presenting so eloquently the needs that we hope to be meeting with the publication of these papers this week. It is really my pleasure and my great privilege to serve as the director of the center, the Ehlers-Danlos Society Center for Clinical Care and Research here at GBMC in the Harvey Institute for Human Genetics. Greater Baltimore Medical Center is a very unusual place in that it is a community hospital which hosts an Institute for Human Genetics. And it is thanks to the foresight of Dr. Mayman Cohen, who hired me 12 years ago, that the Harvey Institute was founded here at Greater Baltimore Medical Center. And it is really a fantastic opportunity to be here and providing genetic services to the community in this fabulous hospital. So as John mentioned earlier, the classification of the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes have not been changed since 1997, when they were proposed at a meeting in France called the Villefranche meeting, and what we have come to know as the Villefranche nosology. And at that time, there were 6 types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that were recognized. We called them the classical hypermobility, vascular, kyphoscoliosis, arthrochalasia, and dermatosparaxis types. And this publication was actually in the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 1998. And it is the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 2017 that will be publishing our new classification and new guidelines for clinical care. The need for a revision of the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome's classification was recognized in 2012 when Drs. Francisca Malfait and Anne de Pape hosted a meeting in Ghent in Belgium. And I'd like to thank Dr. Malfait for the slides that I'm using describing the history of this revision. There was a subsequent meeting in Paris in 2013 and in Glasgow in 2015. And shortly thereafter, the Ehlers-Danlos Society and EDS UK stepped up to provide much needed logistical and financial support to help move the effort forward. And as a result of their efforts, their tireless efforts, we had a meeting in New York in May of 2016 to discuss the classification and also the clinical care guidelines for the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes. And we anticipate there will be another meeting in Ghent in 2018 to review where we are, how well the classification is working, and how well our clinical guidelines are doing in providing the much needed care for patients with Ehlers-Danlos syndromes. The goals of the Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome Symposium in May of 2016 were the following. We wanted to build a new nosology, a new classification defining very clear and implementable diagnostic criteria. It was recognized that there was a need for defining new types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and also to begin the process by which management and care guidelines are being developed for each Ehlers-Danlos syndrome subtype. There were 4 committees on the different types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that were chaired by members of the steering committee for the international consortium. And there were working groups on multiple different areas of comorbidity within the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, including a group that looked at assessing hypermobility using the Beighton score, physiotherapy, orthopedic surgery, autonomic dysfunction and fatigue, the issue of pain, which so severely plagues many sufferers with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, the psychological aspects of EDS and gastrointestinal involvement, neurological complications, allergy immunology, and oral manifestations. And each of these working groups then developed a paper which summarizes the current state of our knowledge, the areas in which knowledge is lacking, and research which will need to be done to fill in those gaps. It's basically a roadmap for future work in the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes. And as a result of those efforts, excuse me, we now have 13 different types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome which are recommended and for which clear diagnostic guidelines have been established. In addition, a proposal has been put forth, and we intend to utilize it for the recognition of a spectrum of joint hypermobility. So, Dr. Marco Castori from Italy has proposed that there is a spectrum of joint hypermobility conditions for people who do not meet the diagnostic criteria for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. They may have joint hypermobility which is asymptomatic, or they may have joint hypermobility which is symptomatic, or they may meet the diagnostic criteria for another syndrome which is accompanied by joint hypermobility. So the spectrum of joint hypermobility runs from asymptomatic, generalized joint hypermobility all the way through to the hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And in between, we have multiple other types of generalized joint hypermobility, which may be symptomatic. So, and that would be called generalized hypermobility spectrum disorder. If people have peripheral hypermobility, in other words, involving only the fingers and the toes, that may be asymptomatic, in which we would call it asymptomatic peripheral joint hypermobility, or if it is symptomatic, we would call it peripheral hypermobility spectrum disorder. So we now have names to apply for those people who are so desperately seeking diagnoses. We have a clear means of providing a diagnosis of hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and all the other types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that have been defined by the consortium. And for those people who have joint hypermobility but do not meet the diagnostic criteria, we have new names, new conditions that we have described very carefully and are outlined in this publication. So I believe that this classification is going to enable people to achieve diagnostic knowledge much more quickly. I hope fervently within the next 5 years that we will not have people saying, it took me 40 years, 44 years, 16 years. I found that so moving. We really need to do better, and I believe that these publications will enable us to do so. So thank you very much for your attention and for being here and for helping us to spread the word about the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Francomano, and thanks again, Lara, to you and Dr. Chisar for coming here today. And I want to echo their appreciation for everybody in attendance today, as well as the media. Thank you for coming out. We're going to hold a Q&A session right now. Any questions and answers? We're welcome to take questions from the press, as well as from the attendees here today. So, yes.
Could you lay out for somebody with the syndrome, you know, say weeks ago, what is going to be different from when they went to the doctor a few weeks ago to when they go to the doctor after these new guidelines? And whoever is welcome to answer.
So before anybody answers that question, please do me a favor. If you ask the question, please identify yourself and also what outlet you are.
WBAL, the NBC station in Baltimore, for those of you who are not from here.
Great, thank you. And who do you want to address that question? Please also. It's
I'm
to
not
any member of the board.
Who's best to answer? Whoever would like to answer that one. Basically, what is the patient impact from before this new guidelines to after this new guidelines?
You good to take that, doctor? You good?
I'm happy to answer.
Okay.
Hold on 1 second.
So the diagnostic process for the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes will be modified based on the new guidelines that are being published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics. The biggest change is actually for the hypermobile type of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. The Villefranche criteria for diagnosis of hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome was relatively lax, if you'll excuse that expression in this context. The guidelines that have been proposed now are much stricter in a way. It requires recognition of the Ehlers-Danlos as a syndrome, so the multi-organ involvement. And people with generalized joint hypermobility but without organ involvement will be diagnosed as having hypermobility spectrum disorder. If they meet the diagnostic criteria, the new diagnostic criteria for hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, then obviously they will be diagnosed with hypermobile EDS. So there may be some people who met the diagnostic criteria previously but do not meet the new diagnostic criteria. We are saying to those people, there's no need for establishing a new diagnosis. You don't have to rush to get reevaluated. But I do think that the people who are being evaluated now under the new guidelines will have a more accurate representation of what their underlying hereditary connective tissue disorder really is.
Which would mean what? Faster treatment, or better treatment, or more specialized treatment, or?
It will be more specified treatment. We want to treat everyone who is symptomatic according to their symptoms. So if people are suffering from pain, we want to address that pain. If they have dysautonomia, we want to address that dysautonomia. And we hope that everyone who is treating these patients will recognize that the comorbidities that we see in hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome are also present in many patients with the hypermobility spectrum disorders. So recognition of those comorbidities is very important, and management of those comorbidities is very important. And really, I think this is one of the biggest contributions of this publication, that we're putting together the recognition that pain is associated with these disorders, GI disturbances are associated with these disorders, immunologic deficits are associated with these disorders, because many, many doctors have never really made that connection. And so people, when they come with this long list of complaints, are not believed. It's just, how can one person be suffering from all these things? But truly, there are these multiple comorbidities associated with both the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes and the hypermobility spectrum disorders.
If I could add, both Laura and Dr. Francomano, I think, have pointed out that the diagnosis should be faster, so there should be less searching of families and individuals for their diagnosis. As Laura pointed out, individuals bounce from one specialist to the next, and they're confused and they're yearning for the diagnosis so that they can get help and get on with their lives. And I think this classification should make it faster for people that are not as expert as Dr. Francomano to really zero in on the correct diagnosis.
Yes, if I could just add to that, that's another benefit from this, that we would like people to be able to visit specialists across the disciplines and be able to receive that diagnosis, whereas at the moment, unless you see a specialist in EDS, then you're not going to receive that diagnosis. We've wanted to make this very easy for any doctor to be able to apply it, and we hope that this will provide them that ability. Another thing that we hope will come for the patients is validation, because that's something that really hasn't been there for so long, because it's been neglected for that 20-year period by the wider medical audience. Then there hasn't been that validation there for the patients when they do get their diagnosis even. It's not respected, it's not really thought of as anything that's serious, it's still thought of as quite benign. And this really shows what it could be in that kind of vast spectrum that patients can sit on. And lastly, the thing that it adds, I think, to the whole community, both patients and medical professionals, is the opportunity for us to now research thoroughly into these syndromes and disorders, so we can find out causation. We know that there's this relationship between the comorbidities, but why? Once we can prove that causation, we can then have the ability to potentially add it into criteria and really learn more about how we can treat them, how we can manage them, and then maybe one day the dream of a cure.
Any other questions from the audience? Any questions from the members of the media? Once again, I want to thank Dr. Francomano, Dr. Chassar, and Lara Bloom for joining us today, and I want to thank you all for coming to our special announcement this afternoon. At this point, we're going to conclude the engagement, and want to hope everybody else has a nice day the rest of the way. Thank you.